Where did they live? What did they look like? What were their customs? In short, who are we? In this series of podcasts, we will meet and chat with people from Guyanese and other West Indian communities who've been asking these and other related questions. Who was that great-great-great-grandmother and that great-great-great-grandfather? As some folks like to say, if you don't know where you're from, then how are you going to know where you're going? And why would you say it is important for us to know or understand our family's history?
The thing is, it's like a lot of us, you have that relative in the family who knows everybody who was connected. And we hear the stories, but most of us don't write it down. Most of us don't put it in some form that the following generations can sort of read it and relate to. And it's important because every single person has a story. I love that line in the Desiderata where, whether they're humble, the lowest person, every single person has a story. And I love talking to people to find out what their story is. And it was really and truly an honor to be able to look in my own family tree and get the stories of the different people whose names I had known my whole life, but I really didn't know their stories. So I always tell friends and family to ask the older relatives who are still here with us now, that are still here, to ask them what they know. Because later on, 10 years from now, when everybody has sort of passed on, you'll be saying, I should have asked Auntie so-and-so. She could always tell you who was the relative. So instead of waiting until they're no longer here, get a video camera, sit in front of them, and ask them a few questions. And at least you'll have it for your archives that you can pass on to the rest of the generations.
Okay, and remind us of who that one person was in your family that did that.
Well, starting from in the past, my great aunt Clarice, she was the one who kept all of the photographs. So I have photographs of my great aunts and uncles from when they were in their teens. And she had a little old album, and she made sure everybody's name was written on the back, what ages the people were in the photographs, if she knew that. And then Aunt Daisy, who was Aunt Daisy was younger than she was. Aunt Daisy was the one who started a family tree, which gave me all of the spouses for each of the 11 siblings, which we haven't asked me that question yet. But
that's all right.
So Aunt Daisy had written a tree with a little bit of the family's history. Then my dad, when he started doing his research, he also asked people for information. So I have a little family tree from Uncle Willie. Uncle Willie over here, he did a little family tree. I have one from him. Uncle Joseph and Uncle George wrote their family, their own personal history, which told me about their childhood growing up in Guyana, what it was like when they went to college, and their life after college. So then I have some information also from my grandfather, who was the second child. He wrote about his experience going to Kaituur, and he wrote about some of the dreams that he had and some of his experiences, and also told me one-on-one. So I have a bunch of different people who were my inspiration, not just one person. And then my dad, because he had started, my father was Lawrence Smart, because he had started and he had compiled some information that I didn't have. It was the generations that left me with information. So.
Okay. In our first episode, we got Jackie talking before we allowed her to introduce herself. So let's address that. Please meet Jacqueline Smart, who is in the process of publishing a book on her family's history. Start with your full name.
And I'm Jacqueline Smart.
No middle name? Did they give you a middle name?
Yes, I have a middle name. I don't want to give a middle name. Leave me alone. Jacqueline Smart. Yeah, so Jacqueline Smart. I was born in England. My mom and dad met while they were studying in England. My mom was doing nursing at St. Giles Hospital in England. She is Jamaican. And my father was doing engineering at Hammersmith College. He started out doing architecture, and then he got into doing engineering. So when he came back to Guyana, he worked with the Ministry of Works. They met on a blind date, actually. A friend of my mom, one of her nurse friends, was going on a date with a gentleman whose name I don't know. And he was bringing along a friend, so she asked my mom if she would go along with them on the date. That's how my mom and dad met. They went to a carnival, they were going all over the rides, they had a wonderful time, and the two of them hit it off, while her friend and the other chap didn't. So that's how they connected, and they stayed in touch. Actually, back then they didn't have computers, but in where the dorms where my mom lived as a nursing student and where my dad lived, they were telephones. You had a little phone that everybody used. So they would set a time and call each other. They would go on dates, and that's how they connected. My mom made sure that she finished her nursing degree. My dad did most of his, but he was sort of getting a little tired of being in school. They got married in 1964, and then he was offered Hamilton Green and Forbes Burnham, who my dad had worked with at the New Amsterdam City Council prior to going to England, had come to England to recruit some of the students who were there, the Guyanese students, to have them come back to Guyana because they were going to become independent, and they wanted as much talented Guyanese people as possible. So he was one of the recruits who went back to Guyana in 1969, and that's how I moved to Guyana with them. And then my youngest sister, so it was myself and my sister Caroline, and then my youngest sister Sandra was born in Guyana.
So you were the eldest?
I'm the eldest, yeah.
Go placidly amid the noise and haste, and remember what peace there may be in silence. As far as possible without surrender, be on good terms with all persons. Speak your truth quietly and clearly, and listen to others, even the dull and ignorant. They too have their story. Avoid loud and aggressive persons. They are vexations to the spirit. If you compare yourself with others, you may become vain and bitter, for always there will be greater and lesser persons than yourself.
You are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here, and whether or not it is clear to you, no doubt the universe is unfolding as it should.
Now, given the timeline regarding the arrival of African slaves in Guyana during the 1600s, as against the 19th century beginnings of indentureship, and the fact that African families were deliberately and systematically separated and ripped apart, tracing our African bloodlines will continue to be an uphill task. I touched a little on this in my chat with Harelda.
A question there, because I think you would have been able to identify the European guy by name and everything. Could you relay that name for our audience?
Yeah, so we are out of the James Chichester clan. There was James Chichester who left the UK roughly somewhere about 20 years plus or minus, and we're still verifying everything, and came to Guyana. He then has 7 sons and 1 daughter with Betsy Anjo, a Guyanese, a woman of African descent. And so our history shows that she came from the west coast of Africa. And out of those 8 children, we have all we call the different lines in the Chichester family. And they lived all over Guyana, mostly in Mycone. It started in Cottage, Mycone, and Perseverance, Mycone. And then some went to Manchester, Bury, some went to Essequibo, some went to Grove, some went to Georgetown, some stayed in Mycone. And they had many, many, many children, out of which you and I are products today.
Okay. Now, Betsy and Joe, you're saying she would have been the person that James Chichester, who came from England, he had a relationship with, right?
Correct.
Is there a way of us knowing, maybe through DNA, a DNA profile, as to the likelihood of Betsy, Betsy Ann being, whether it's Nigerian, Ghanaian, East Africa, how do you think we can be able to predict that? Because we know that unlike the European side, where stuff is documented, it's difficult for us, we of primarily Afro-Guyanese descent, to actually really trace our line back to the motherland.
And I think that is when our research will really take on a whole new level, because what we're talking now about as limited documents, we're also talking about people who may have changed names. We're looking at port of entry, port of exit. We're looking at immigration records, if there are any. We're looking at when people left the boats. And so that takes our lineage and our research to a whole new level, which I predict that's where we got. So what we started with is what we knew naturally, because we're from the Chichesters. And in that process, we discover her name. And so I would say that's probably the next step. The next step is to find out all the siblings of James Chichester, because he came from the UK, and then find out who is Betsy Anjo. How did she end up in Guyana? Was she a slave woman? Was she a free woman? Where did she come from? Who was her parents? Who were her siblings? How did she get the name Joe? That is of much, much, much interest to me.
Right. And is that Joe spelled as we know, Joe, or is it spelled differently?
Well, I've seen it spelled Joe, but many things I've seen, I've learned to say it is still being verified. So we are verifying. All information is a living document, so it's subject to verification. And so as of right now, it's Joe.
Okay. And there are no drawings, pictures, portraits, or anything of either James or Betsy and Joe?
There are pictures I know of James. I've seen a couple of different, not of him, but I've seen of British men. And I don't think it would be hard to find, actually, once we start diving into the research of James Chichester. I don't have it directly, but I'm sure we eventually will. Betsy and Joe, I'm not sure how much information was documented and what is out there, but I believe there's something, and with a team of researchers, we can find out more. Yeah.
Evidently, as we learned from Herelda, one can sometimes get to the start of that uniquely Guyanese part of our ancestral journey. In this regard, we also heard from Morty.
Let's quickly say, on both the paternal and maternal side. On the paternal side, how far back were you able to trace in terms of, your dad's side of the family?
Yeah, so on my dad's side of the family, and take this with, that a lot of what I am saying is basically word of mouth, right? Okay. A lot of I have not had an opportunity to say, let me go home and spend some time in the archive and try to confirm these things. So a lot of what I have is based on hearsay, as we would say in Guyana, and just documenting those things. So on my paternal side, I was able to get back as far back as my third great grandparents, right? So this would be my dad's second great grandparents, and those were on the left side. The name was called John Charles Leps, and his wife was called Georgiana. I think Sander is how I saw it in some documentation, and I can reference that later too. And it was Sander, not with the S, and I don't know if that's just based on how things was documented, if it should have been Sanders or not. Right. But my understanding is the left side of the family is of Dutch from the Dutch descendants. On the Lindy side, I was able to get maybe one level down, not third, but second great grandfather, and his wife, and he was a Travis Lindy that was married to a Mary Spangenberg. And the reason I got this is, like, again, it's not through any sort of archival information. Right, I was actually able to get this information, at least from the Lindy side, from a relative that had a letter that her mom documented of her grandparents, and her grandparents was this Travis Lindy and Mary Spangenberg. That I was, and again, you take what you can from there until you're able to confirm it otherwise. So that's the information that I am going for.
All right, going back to your dad's side, the two names, Georgina and the other person that you mentioned, that you traced it back
Charles
to.
Lepps.
Yeah, John Charles Lepps. What were their ethnicity and what were their roles at the time?
Yeah, so I don't know of their occupations at the time, but what I have heard was actually in that letter, it was stated, for instance, that Georgina was of no, I'm sorry, Georgina was on the left side, so I don't have anything outside of just finding information through my research. So Georgina and John Charles Lepps, my understanding is that they are of Dutch descendants, and I got that from a descendant of that same family. His name is Odwin Lepps. He indicated to me, he lives out in Canada. He actually indicated to me as a small boy, when he grew up with his grandparents, who would have been my great grandparents' sibling, that hearing them speak, one was speaking Dutch and one was speaking German, and it was the Lepps grandparent of him. His name was Herman Lepps, Herman Alfred Lepps, was speaking Dutch, and his grandmother, who was called Annie, and she was known by the name of Putty, Annie Lindy, or Putty Lindy. She was the one that was speaking German. So that's the only record I have as to them being of that. And I did talk to someone else, and he indicated that he have records that there was a Jacob Lepps that came to Guyana like in the 1840s. Okay. And based on the record that he has also, that Lepps came to Guyana.
And that person would have come from Holland,
that person would have come from Holland. Apparently came young, but maybe with relatives. Now I'm still trying to I can see through DNA testing. Mm-hmm. That's how I actually connected with him, that there is a DNA connection, but I cannot confirm to this day as to how Jacob Lepps and my side of my ancestors are connected. And you can sort of extrapolate in some of these things, and you can say, okay, they were probably cousins, but I don't have any concrete evidence. So like in my tree, I would actually connect people as to where I think they might be, but with a question mark, saying, just in case somebody ever discover it or come across it. These are not definitive things, but they are more, just based on evidence as to where the connection might be. my mom's side, you hear the stories of from the Bender. Bender, I think would have been German, and that's just more how the family came about, but nothing striking, but just an understanding that this Bender person actually end up marrying a slave girl, and that's pretty much where we came from, and I've got those sort of lineage.
Right. Right. I was just about to ask about that. In terms of the people that they would have had now relationships with. Do you have the names, like that particular slave girl that you just referenced? Would you, in your research, would you have the names of that person and all?
Yeah. So the name that was mentioned a few times is this. So I think the original Bender was a Bernard Bender, and he was married to a slave girl by the name of Tatatan Serini. Right, is the name that we have. Okay. So it's sort of and there again, I came across. Well, a letter was provided to me from my aunt, my mom's sister, who is in New Amsterdam, Aunt Dorothy. That a letter was provided to her that was dictated by a uncle, Derek Bender. That sort of captured this, this timeline and some of the names. So those are some of the things that I hold on to, right? And saying, look, I'm getting this from elders, and I would sort of try to listen to other stories and reconcile it with these letters that I have. So from the elders, I probably have maybe three sets of these letters, right, that I can reference. Right, there is that one from the Bender side, that was dictated by an Uncle Derek, and then I've got the one from the Lindy side that was done by Rita, and that was her grandparents, which would have been the Lindy. And then I've got the story from my Uncle Lloyd that sort of talk about the Patwa side. So those are as much documents that I have, right, outside of something official, that I can constantly read these things, and I'm not kidding you. These letters, if I read them 10 times, it's probably not because every time you read it, you find something. You find something in there, right?
Wow. Okay.
That helps you to, like in the DNA search, I would sometimes wonder, well, how is it that I'm seeing my mom having connection to Patwa, who is on my dad's maternal side, right? But when you for instance, with that Bender letter, one of the things that was mentioned in that letter was this original Bernard Bender with Tata Tansarini had kids, and one of the kids married a Patwa.
Okay.
Right. But that's how it was mentioned in the letter. They didn't have the name. They just knew that a daughter of the Bender and Tata Tansarini daughter married a Bender. I mean a Patwa. Right. So maybe that's an indication as to why I can see, my mom relating to Patwa, maybe, right? But I'm just saying these sort of things are out there, and they're constantly, would be great to be able to kind of find the documents and say, this is how it happens.
Okay. Some months ago, I discovered a site with the headline, Guten Voices. On the homepage it reads, the aim of this site is to make available Guten family history information, provide a means of collaboration between extended family members, and to make available several sources for researchers of families with British Guyana connections. So who were the Van Coutens? I asked myself this question after noting that they had compiled an extensive list of the colonists of British Guyana. If you are a Guyanese with European ancestry and you follow this list, you might well encounter the beginnings of your European lineage. Harolda has spoken of a James Chichester, and I've made a note to check in with Jackie and Morty as to whether these names mean anything to them. The Lindy here is spelled differently, but who knows? Well, this is all for now. If this was your first visit, please do watch episode 1 when time permits. And thank you for being here. And to our returning viewers, thanks again for gracing us with your presence. And please, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe.
Just imagine. Imagine you're inside a quick dance, somewhere east, west, north of France. Imagine you are a Guyanese, so you know about coconut rice with peas. Imagine you know about the comfort jump, and you know how to wiggle and jiggle to the ground. Imagine you are a Chinaman, but they tell you that your mother was a hometown woman. Imagine. Just imagine. Just imagine.